Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's panel on open mapping to address donor-driven risks. My name is Carolyn Flory, and I am the Senior Director of Technology for Development at Mercy Corps, which is a global humanitarian and development organization that works to build secure, protective, and just communities in the places that we work, often at the intersection of conflict and crisis. I'm very excited to be moderating our session with four members and of the Open Knowledge Kit team across a range of organizations. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from all four. So just in terms of background, Open Knowledge Kit is a free and open source toolkit to empower local communities with digital employment through geospatial data collection, analytics, and monitoring toward the stewardship of their economic, climate, and social prosperity. And over the course of our panelist presentations and during the discussion and question and answer session, we're going to dig into how OKKit addresses some of the key barriers to achieving the SDGs, looking at things like short-term and uncoordinated donor projects led by community outsiders, expensive proprietary and closed technology systems, the gender equity gap, and decent work. We will be discussing how to truly unlock the barriers to the use of free and open source software, specifically looking at open mapping and open data for these global challenges to enable the flow of accurate real-time information in a truly localized manner. So today, just a bit of logistics for today's run of show. We're going to hear from our four panelists who will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes each. And then we'll have a panel discussion between our four panelists and then open it up to the audience for question and answer. So I encourage all of you to submit your questions throughout the presentations, and we'll make sure to get to those, get as many of those answered as possible. And so I'm going to be introducing each of our speakers before they begin their presentations. So our first speaker is Selena Agaton. Selena is the founder and managing director of MapPH. She helps regenerate supply chains in indigenous food and creative economies and conflict areas to support governance, gender, and MSMEs. She co-developed the Open Knowledge Kit Regeneration Program to create local and remote work with free and open source geospatial tools and cross-sector coordination to address knowledge stewardship, gender gaps, and climate change. She leads projects for the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and APEC Canada Growing Business Partnership. She's also the executive director of the Creative Economy Council of the Philippines and co-chair of OSGeo Oceania Outreach and Communications. She was a community engagement director and strategist for Open Cities and the Martin Prosperity Institute, and the digital director and policy advisor to the deputy mayor of Toronto's mayoral campaign. She graduated with a BSc in Psychology, Equity Studies, and Photography from the University of Toronto. And she grew up in Jakarta, Manila, and Toronto, and is currently based in Indonesia. So we are all praying for sound connectivity. I think we're all on island nations over here. So Selena, I will turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Carolyn. I'm just about to share my screen now, so I'll just do that right now. And just confirming you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see.
Great. Okay, great. So just as Carolyn mentioned, I grew up in Jakarta, Manila, and Toronto, which has really informed a lot of the work that I do. And before moving back to the Philippines, I was based in Toronto for 20 years, where I developed cross-sector, self-sustaining funding models, and primarily for nonprofits, working with about 7,000 nonprofits in Ontario, 3 levels of government, the 200 corporations headquartered in Toronto, as well as the volunteer community. So it was during that time where I developed systems that shifted funding based on local priorities of nonprofits versus the mandates of donor organizations or whatever funding trends happened to be occurring at the time. So it's during this time as well that I became involved with the civic technology sector. And during the Haiti earthquake, Canada had the largest population of Haitians, and where I became involved with the OpenStreetMap mapping community and really began to put together a cross-sector system to be able to address many of the barriers to achieving the SDGs. And after Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, I returned to Manila to serve my country. So just to start off with Open Knowledge Kit, it's a free and open source toolkit and employment regeneration program to empower local women with digital employment and the stewardship of economic, climate, and social prosperity of their communities. And the main reasons to the development of this program is 5 key challenges. The first being that many local and international organizations, and particularly in the Asia Pacific region, are at very high risk for disasters and climate change. And there's often a tangle of cross-sector folks from the local and international space during an emergency. And we have to remember that many of these communities are already vulnerable, have already been traumatized, and even more so during the pandemic. And so the program is really developed with the community's best interests in mind for the long term. Next, the main challenge that we've been seeing is that there's a lot of new technologies that have been applied, and many donors are eager to fund new technologies, but we have to remember that it's been over a decade later and we're still talking about the digital divide, and we're still missing basic infrastructure such as good roads, clean water, internet access, healthcare facilities, etc. And so the priority is really to apply technology tools that benefit the community. And this is the reason why we use free and open source software. So we reduce those barriers to participation where in terms of products like Google and Esri that are closed systems, they're proprietary, they're very expensive. If you read the fine print, they require licensing to be able to share their data. And ultimately, we feel that communities should have access to their own data and to be able to edit their data as needed. And in being in the field where 70% of my time is actually spent in the field, I've encountered so many different map for ransom or data for ransom, essentially, circumstances where local communities are told that the mapping process or the data collection process is very complicated, and so they're forever having to pay these licensing fees or consultants to do the knowledge creation of their community. And particularly because a lot of research and data collection projects involve outsiders that are brought into communities. And as I mentioned, these are already traumatized communities and high-risk communities that are constantly dealing with disasters and climate change effects. And particularly the participation of women. Women continue to be invisible in these communities and missing from the data collection and research representation. I'll reference in terms of the gender gap mapping that we've done, the World Bank project. This is part of a larger World Bank project that I'll discuss later, where our Philippine gender gap mapping study, this took place over 6 provinces in rural, agricultural, and conflict areas. And what our data showed when we quantified and qualified through 19-page interviews is that women held more paying jobs and often brought in more income, while completing majority of the household tasks, and they traveled the longest distances more frequently, but mostly on foot and on unpaved roads of poor quality. And when they had to pay for transportation, they often paid higher rates than the men. Next, especially now during the pandemic, the problem of unemployment and underemployment is even greater. And for many communities, they lack the agency to be able to have, to dictate what their career path in life would be and rely on middlemen for employment. And lastly, we all know the risks of climate change that are amplified above all the many risks that communities are already dealing with. And particularly for climate change, we know that it's highly political. The costs to complete climate change mapping are often prohibitive. There's corruption involved. There's a lack of local capacity sometimes to do this work. So these are the many challenges that many communities face. And so Open Knowledge Kit was really developed as a free and open source, working mostly offline suite of tools that really place the local community at the center. And what we're moving towards, and hope that the funders and policymakers in the session will help support, that we move to a local procurement model where data collection and research are first sourced within the community. And we can even start as low as 20% local procurement, which is what I've worked on in other governments. And particularly because anchoring these projects within communities helps anchor the data as more reliable data and provides employment to the local community as well. So I'll just do a very quick run through of these tools. We've got 3D Street View, 360 Libre, and Open Drone Map. These are 3 of some of the tools that we use. And particularly the hardware costs are much lower using our technologies, and these are documented on GitHub as well, compared to industry standards that are extremely expensive. And when it comes to the software costs, our software is zero in terms of costing versus, again, the big tech tools that you see on the right. So to show how the basic tools work, we use Open Data Kit, which is a free and open source survey and data collection tool. So the beauty of this tool is once you've trained the community, they can take on other photo, video, surveys, mapping data collection in the field for other opportunities for public and private sector projects. So it's very easy to learn, and it takes about an hour to set up on any smartphone. And best of all, it works without internet. So data can be uploaded and surveys can be edited even live when there's internet access. And this is one of the first women that we've trained, actually. So during the pandemic, I've been training Indigenous women in several countries on how to use Open Knowledge Kit. And we've been using Facebook Messenger because of the lack of internet access, or because many communities have lost the ability to pay for internet in their communities. So I've never met Diohana in person, and I trained her over 20 minutes. And so what you will see here is the process with which we can create these 3D reconstructions, which we'll talk about more in detail at the next presentation. So this details what it looks like when she's taking photos. So essentially she's taking photos in a clock-like fashion and at 3 angles. So facing up, facing straight, and then facing down. And then our software, so this is the 3D Street View processing, which takes a second to load. She used a smartphone that was $150, and this is her very first try. So you can see that in stunning high resolution, this is actually photogrammetry that you're looking at, which means that you're looking at data. So we can actually extract the size of these potholes, the width of the road, the height of the buildings. So post-disaster, pre-disaster, you can perform infrastructure assessments. You can rapidly assess and prioritize road infrastructure or road repair. And also what we're doing now in Indonesia is being able to catalog different species and heirloom species for identification for tourism purposes. And so this can show how a 20-minute training can lead to really high quality imagery that can help better plan, prioritize, and most importantly, validate using video how to work these. So 360 Libre is, again, a 2-day training tool. If you need higher volumes of photos, like a Google Street View equivalent, and then Open Drone Map, which we'll talk more about later, is actually the basis of what's used for climate and disaster change modeling, which can be done now that we've shown at about 1/5 to 1/3 the price of traditional modeling. We also work with Open River Cam, which is a very low cost way of being able to safely and accurately monitor water levels and current flows with advanced warning systems, compared to, again, the very expensive standard that you see on the right. So this is actually a screen grab of what it looks like through the lens of the camera, and you see the water level readings there, where you can have alerts as water levels rise. Part of the work that we do is also training the local community, and we really prioritize people that have good local knowledge and an interest to learn to map. So we've taught people from the age of 6 all the way to 60 plus. So it doesn't require a technical background to learn to map. And you can see many of the brands that support and use OpenStreetMap. And the example on the right that shows that we can remotely and safely, especially during the pandemic, map areas using satellite imagery and tracing images. This is a sample of the mapping where we're tracing satellite imagery. And what you see on the bottom right there in the gray areas indicates unpaved roads. So particularly for evacuation sites or creating and prioritizing local infrastructure, you can extract the data of all the unpaved roads in a community as an example. During these 2-day workshops, we also teach QGIS, which is a really powerful mapping and big data analytics tool that, again, we've been able to successfully teach everyone how to map. So next, part of the reason we're so excited to actually support mapping is that the mapping and data collection industry has the highest growth rates in Asia Pacific. And for kids and adults to be able to learn how to map so quickly and so proficiently, this provides them with unique analytical skills that are transferable regardless of which industry they work in. And the starting salary for a mapper is $50,000 to $60,000 US in US and Canada. And mapping can be done safely and remotely. And so it doesn't require migrating to a congested urban area, and people can safely work at home and stay with their families. So next, this is the larger World Bank contract that I had worked on, leading a team of 200 people across 6 provinces to complete rural agricultural mapping of transportation, infrastructure, industrial logistics. And then we also trained 180 cross-sector mappers. So for all our projects, I identify who the progressive leaders are across all the sectors. And that way, across business, nonprofit, academe, and local community leaders, we're teaching everybody and introducing often the community, because sometimes they've never even met, even in the smallest village. And that way, if there's a change in politics, a change in leadership across any of the sectors, the mapping work can continue. And we're able to reduce the gaps and overlaps in efforts. What you'll notice here is that it's all women. And the reason we do that is we actually separate the women and the men now from the workshops, because we find the productivity rate really exponentially increases when they're separated, as women have such a strong local knowledge being of their own community, and they're rarely asked for their input. So they're really proficient mappers, very detail oriented, and excel at field data collection and digital mapping as well. And this is part of the program that we're working to scale with women farmers in bamboo villages here in Indonesia. So part of this, again, in managing risk, is identifying that there are many different risks to a community when infrastructure is built, whether it's intended or unintended. So we overlay these different criteria, such as road planning for prioritization in proximity to agricultural areas, based on costs, level of terrain, most importantly, disaster risk, because this is often left out of the equation. And our partner, University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, will be presenting their accurate data and climate change. And then the combined weighted criteria, so that we have a more accurate analysis of infrastructure in a community. We also map the efforts, because especially for many disaster risk prone countries, there is such an overlap, and the highest priority communities tend to have gaps. So what you see here is the data from the Philippines' 45 largest corporate and family foundations overlaid on a map. So what you see in red, the darker red shades, indicate a 60 to 65% rate of poverty. And the colored dots that you see represent the types of projects that have been funded. So from DRR, education, to health. And what you see with the larger circles mean that there's a larger overlap of those funders within a community, whereas you see fewer of those overlaps in the highest priority poverty areas. And for Open Knowledge Kit, even before the pandemic, we were working remotely, and we've actually taught remote mapping for over a decade now. And these are the 5 different country teams that we work with to show that this is immediately implementable, very easily implementable program, no matter where you are. And so I wanted to bring up these 3 immediate opportunities for scaling and impact, being that we are in such urgent times during the pandemic for planning recovery and also dealing with disaster risk. And so women can readily be trained over 2 days to be able to collect data and fill the vast gaps of data that we need to plan a pandemic recovery, particularly in the Asian region, where most of the economies, majority of the micro to medium enterprise are actually led by women. And so being able to address their unique infrastructure needs, where women usually have the least access to enterprise essential infrastructure, training facilities, processing facilities, credit, etc. Their needs need to be prioritized in order to achieve any form of SDGs, let alone a pandemic recovery. And particularly from my work with the creative economy, where artists and artisans can actually work safely and remotely work from home, since they represent the arts, food, and culture communities. And yet they remain invisible to the government because they're largely unregistered. Next is the International Road Assessment Program, of which World Bank is also a partner. And so we're partners in this initiative. And being the UN Decade of Action for Road Safety, these very detailed technical road assessments take place at per 100 meters, which provide a tremendous amount of employment that's very badly needed in communities right now. So what we've just completed actually very recently in the Philippines, this is the World Bank International Road Assessment Program assessment that we did with Fredeng Engineering, is we've actually developed a very low-cost model of transforming what is typically expensive technology and outsider models to a very localized model. So these pictures that you see are actually what the new low-cost versions of traffic volume and speed surveys look like. So we're using found objects. What you see on the left are soda bottles and on the right are plastic chairs. And we use these as markers to video record as vehicles pass left and right to calculate their speed. So by using this very local model and not bringing in outsiders to the community, we remove all those related costs and are able to pay for data surveys, for surveys like this, from $25 to $50 to $100 per hour per day, which is a tremendous amount of a critical employment that's needed during this time. So based on the gender data that we've been sharing, is that the International Road Assessment Program is really a gateway to helping prioritize the unique needs and develop a gender equity and climate change index to be able to prioritize infrastructure that's being funded or planned currently in communities. So this shows the ability to prioritize local roads and local essential infrastructure, especially disaster-related infrastructure, and the valuable contributions of women from micro to medium enterprise. And lastly, we'll be covering the disaster and climate change modeling in the next presentation. But for Indigenous and community conserved areas that sometimes lack the skills or the ability to pay for very expensive software, this presents a unique opportunity to remotely train and have an accessible, easily implementable model that can then be monitored very safely online using free access to satellite imagery. And that's actually the last slide of my presentation. So I look forward to your questions and comments later on.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Selena. Really appreciate it. And just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we will get to those. We're going to run through the presentations first and then come back to the panel discussion and question and answer at the end. So for our next speaker is Ivan Gayton. Ivan has over 15 years of experience leading cutting-edge development and deployment of open source mapping and drone technologies for humanitarian aid. He has been head of mission GIS and technical advisor for Doctors Without Borders in numerous countries, including Nigeria, Haiti, Libya, and South Sudan. Ivan conceived and founded the Missing Maps project in 2014 in response to the West Africa Ebola outbreak, conceived and developed MapSwipe, a software for crowdsourced offline mobile image classification for humanitarian mapping. And he also led a collaboration between MSF and Google to create electronic medical records in Ebola centers. Ivan continues to manage or support a suite of community mapping and tech initiatives in approximately 10 countries as part of the humanitarian OpenStreetMap and rainbow sensing. And so I will hand it over to Ivan now. Thanks.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes, sounds like you can. Great. Okay. Thanks for that rather flattering introduction. I think it somewhat overstates my my qualifications. Nevertheless, I'll take it anywhere I can get it. So yeah, I think I want to really emphasize, you know, a lot of people at the Understanding Risk conference are going to be exactly the people that I'm trying to put out of business. So my whole, you know, sort of thrust here, and for a long time it has been, is to move away from the model. I think Selena, you know, hinted at this, that a great deal of the work in the aid sector is done by consultants. As somebody said, as in Alibaba and the 40 consultants, although I don't actually believe that, but you know, consulting, the way the aid sector works is often very exclusive of the people on the ground, and we often excuse that by saying, well, you know, the technology we use is too complicated, the quality of the work that's required is too high, and I just don't buy that. I just don't buy that. So I worked for, you know, 13 years with Doctors Without Borders in a lot of really low resource settings, and it's my experience that people in those settings are utterly capable, are incredibly motivated, and can do really sophisticated work. And what's missing is actually the societal and technological infrastructure to give them a level playing field. So ultimately, what I'm generally talking about here is equity, and the aid industry, which obviously, you know, the whole sector intends to improve lives and outcomes, and ultimately it's a matter of justice. It's a matter of like everyone getting the proper shake that they deserve. If we ourselves don't walk the walk, then that's a problem. So I've come up with a bit of a motto for this as part of my work with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which is a wonderful organization that you should really look up and you know, participate in work with. And the motto is local people, local devices, and open knowledge. That sounds fairly straightforward, right? Local people is obvious. Local people, you know more about the local conditions than outsiders. There's a bit more to it than that, in the sense that, you know, one of the things that we say operationally is neighbors mapping neighbors. When you get someone going to, you know, the 25 houses nearest their own home, the level of trust that's there, the level of access that's there, the level of understanding that's there is completely different from if you bring someone even from the same company, but even from the same country, but from the capital. We have this tendency to bring people from the elite universities and so forth, and that doesn't always actually, you know, meet the genuine meaning of localism, where you have people mapping their own environments, and their own neighbors and their own families. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Local people is fairly obvious. Skipping to the third one, open knowledge. Well, obviously, we talk about open data all the time. Open source, and as I prefer actually the term free software, free as in freedom software, when these tools are proprietary, when you have to have a $3,000 price of entry to even know how to use the software, that's effectively an inequitable barrier. And so, you know, I'm going to throw a blog post that I wrote about this into the chat. And this for me is, again, it's not just a question of operational effectiveness, it's a question of justice. and proprietary software really actually is exclusive of people outside of wealthy countries and outside of the privilege and status that people like me benefit from. Okay, so given the idea that open knowledge is not just sure you can download the data, I've always said open data is not data you can download, it's data you can edit. It's OpenStreetMap, it's Wikipedia, it's things that people can actually reach out and make their own, as opposed to simply having access to download. So local people, local devices, and open knowledge. Local people and open knowledge. All right, we got that. Local devices. Why? What am I talking about there? Well, in the last 10 years, there's been an absolute revolution for the bottom couple of billion people on the planet, which is to say that almost every village, even in the most remote part of rural Congo, there's somebody with a supercomputer. There's somebody with a piece of machinery in their pocket that 25 years ago would have filled an entire room in a university computing center. The mobile computing revolution, the mobile phones, these cell phones that we have, the cell phones that are destroying our children's brains through TikTok and Facebook and WhatsApp and so forth. These are also incredible tools of emancipation. This is an incredible leveler of a global playing field. And when you use devices, if you're the kind of consultant working with understanding risk and working with the kinds of donor-funded projects that we work with, who says we must have 5 centimeter horizontal pixels and 5 and 10 centimeter vertical resolution in our digital elevation models, and we need to have this level of specification for the machinery we use. Again, not only is that exclusive and harmful to equity, you're actually preventing yourself from scaling. If you can do useful work with a cell phone that's available in an African market, you can scale that indefinitely, because there is a mobile phone with a GPS receiver in it in every village in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Yemen and South Sudan. So it's about inclusion. But as a bonus, what comes with doing the right thing comes with doing an effective thing. So our work from the beginning of all of this has been about making the tools in compliance with this philosophy of local people, local devices, and open knowledge, work with the tools that the local people can work with. And if you build it, they will come. The people are able to do this. Okay, I want to show you some stuff here. So I'm going to share my screen. Maybe, probably. We tested this. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if they see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, excellent.
I can
Thank
see
you.
Selena.
Okay. Okay, excellent. Right. So I'm going to start with 3D Street View. So what is this? I mean, Selena actually showed our friend Deohana, who's a young indigenous mother from a conflict-affected area of the Philippines, who with 20 minutes training on Facebook Messenger was able to take a series of photos that actually turn into an extraordinarily detailed data set. And this is not a video. This is me live. And this is on the internet. If you go to 3dstreetview.org, you can actually, it takes a little while to get there. It's still kind of in beta, but you can actually get to the point where you can navigate through this environment by yourself using your keyboard. This is not a video. I am literally playing this thing like a video game right now as we speak. Watch here, I'll drop through the floor. Would I do that if I was in a video? That looks terrible. Now imagine, when we talk about mapping, for 15 years now, we've been doing remote mapping, which actually means looking at satellite imagery, which has typically got a 50 centimeter pixel, and trying to figure out, basically what you can do with that is you can digitize roads, you can digitize water courses, you can digitize buildings. You're looking down from above with a 50 centimeter pixel resolution. That doesn't allow you to do stuff like, I don't know, species identification. It doesn't allow a mechanical engineer to determine what kind of buildings there are. It doesn't allow a civil engineer to determine the state of the road. Look at this pothole here. I can actually steer myself right into the bottom of this pothole. I can tell you the brand of the gum wrapper that's stuck in it. Well, maybe not quite, but almost. The level of detail here, the point is that you can actually get a relatively untrained local person with their own cell phone, their $140 cell phone that I believe she borrowed from her mother, in fact, and they can create a data set that a dozen highly specialized domain level experts could go through and extract useful information from. Suddenly, remote mapping is not just about digitizing buildings and clicking on roads. Suddenly, it's about really sophisticated things that you might be able to ask a biologist or an ecologist or a civil engineer to look at. Here's Zanzibar from a drone. And again, this is using Open Drone Map. All of this stuff is free software. Again, local people, local devices, and open knowledge. This is a moderately sophisticated drone, but it's all free software we've done the processing with. And here's the Zanzibar Cathedral. I show you this because I can also show you what we've got from the Zanzibar Cathedral with a cell phone. Now, this is different. This is supplementary data. This is something that you supplement. There's no way you could get this kind of detail. This is a point cloud taken with, again, a $150 cell phone in Zanzibar. And these are all ground-based photos that a young man named Mohammed took with his phone. Now, imagine the richness when you start adding this kind of data into your drone data set. This is not taken from above. This is not low resolution. This is extraordinarily high resolution, millions of points point cloud that gives you a tremendous detail on the ground about a setting. In this case, the cathedral operators are very excited and working with Mohammed, this young student in Zanzibar, on actually making use of this to improve tourism prospects during Zanzibar's lockdown phase. Now, this, on the other hand, again, in keeping with, as near as possible local devices, this is my own village. I live in a place called Iwo Jima, which is not the famous one from the Second World War films, but 50 kilometers off the south coast of Kyushu in Japan. This is my daughter's school. This is not taken with an expensive drone. This is taken with an $800 Parrot. This is taken with a little quadcopter, which is easily within reach of a local community in Africa. And this was a matter of me in a couple of hours with an $800 drone, taking a series of photos and using completely free software to process this. Now, how do we actually generate these? We're in the process of creating a system called 3D Street View, and it's intended for anyone, any community, any company, any individual who wants to create a 3D environment for whatever they want to do it for. I mean, we're thinking about stuff like, infrastructure monitoring for local people to hold, aid projects to account. We're thinking about tourism. We're thinking about mechanical engineering, and we're thinking about flood resilience and so forth. But my fondest hope is that local people are going to come up with their own use cases. And so this is intended to basically allow someone to start from, I want to make a 3D reconstruction of my environment. Great. Come to this and create yourself a project. It'll send you a QR code with which you configure your phone to use Open Data Kit to take a bunch of photos. Push the process button and you get a mesh out of it. And then we have a way to facilitate you turning that into an playable mesh on the internet that literally you can give someone a website and they can go and explore this environment in 3 dimensions and with 6 degrees of freedom. They can turn and move any way they like, in not just a panorama, but a full 3D reconstruction of their environment. Again, transforming the whole idea of remote mapping from looking down from somebody's really expensive satellite or really expensive fancy drone to people taking control of their own environment and taking ownership of their own environment. So we really hope that more people will get involved in this. And it's not me. It's the people. This is built by people in Tanzania and the Philippines and DRC, and bring them on board. They'll do more for you than you think. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ivan. Really appreciate it. Lots of food for thought after our first two presentations. So I'm really looking forward to and hope we have some good time at the end for some question and answer. Again, just to remind everyone, please do feel free to pop in your questions in the chat, and we will get to those at the end. The next presentation is actually a recorded video from our colleague Stephen Mather, and he has been working, and I think my colleagues are going to help play the video in a moment. Steve has been working in geospatial since 1998, and so much of that in the public sector, working with free and open source software. I'm actually going to, he has a bit of an introduction to himself in his recording, so I will ask our colleagues to play his video.
Hi all, my name is Stephen Vincent Mather, but you can call me Steve. And I'll talk about an important component of the ecosystem of tools that Selena discusses, specifically OpenDroneMap. So I'm calling this presentation Photogrammetry for Everyone, although I've been yelled at enough by photogrammetrists in different continents to know that check your local laws, you may need to befriend a photogrammetrist and borrow a stamp. So who am I? I like to think of myself as a problem solver. I like tricky, large problems, and I like them to make them go away. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, large photogrammetry problems need apply. I've co-authored a book, spent the last more than a decade in free and open source software, a couple decades in public service, 5 years in higher education, and most relevant to my presentation today, I'm the co-founder of the OpenDroneMap ecosystem, which started in 2014. I have very little love for the concept of disruption. I mean, it often feels like watching a war among economic titans. And in the flotsam and jetsam of disruption, there might be opportunity, but it's rare that there's a true window for equity, justice, inclusion, power sharing, and all the other things that we want to see across structural inequities. But we have some interesting opportunities at the moment. The ubiquitous and ever-present and relatively inexpensive availability of pictures is part of that broader opportunity. That, paired with high-quality GPS, gives us the next generation of mapping, the next generation of what we can do within the frameworks of what's already been demonstrated in the networks across OpenStreetMap and a whole ecosystem of open tools. And I think that combination gives us the opportunity that Selena introduced amongst those themes. So one thing I spent a lot of time thinking about is commons-based peer production. It's a concept sort of codified by Hy Benkler, and the idea is that if you have inexpensive tools and connected people and who have a common love for a topic, you get things like free and open source software, like Wikipedia, like OpenStreetMap, and that these common goals of creating software and of creating knowledge together, that these, in connecting people across the world, is really an opportunity that that presents itself more and more the more networked and connected that we are, and the more inexpensive tools that we have to do what we do. So the overall question that I want to frame is, in what ways can we see photogrammetry as a commons process in support of land titles, disaster and climate change models, transportation and logistics planning, infrastructure planning and monitoring? But we don't have time for that. So I'm just going to talk about the opportunity in the context of disaster and climate change models, and what kind of high quality fit for purpose photogrammetric modeling we can do to aid in flood modeling. So you're not going to see any flood modeling models from me today, but you'll see some elevation models that came out of an existing project. So in its simplest form, photogrammetry is turning photographs into measurable, usable data that can be a backup camera on your car to prevent you from backing into your spouse's bumper. But in the case of OpenDroneMap, this is about connecting people who have cameras to be able to create maps and three-dimensional objects in an easy and intuitive way. The idea is that you've got a bunch of images, you've got GPS, and that out of this whole process comes three-dimensional models and geographic products. Whether that's an orthophoto, elevation models, point clouds, or game-like 3D meshes. So in addition to sort of what you'd expect from an open source project, opendromemap.org also has community.opendromemap.org, where you can go and you can learn from others and you can teach and you can participate in a larger ecosystem of people learning how to map the world through these tools together. But we also have commercial support through various folks who have this deployed in the cloud, including webodm.net, which is run by Piero Tofanin, UAV for Geo, who's the sort of the co-founder of the overall ecosystem. So you saw a little bit of what we can do as far as 3D game meshes within this context. Pretty exciting, really useful for those land tenure questions, really useful for questions of transportation, etc. But I'm going to talk a little bit about digital terrain models. And if you're familiar with the Zanzibar Mapping Initiative, this was a massive effort to map the Zanzibar archipelago with 350,000 images across the entire area using small drones. It's the largest project of its kind, piloted by local pilots, surveyed by local surveyors. So I had the privilege of actually working with the data and putting together some of the and also products from ZMI. And that result is actually a hydrologically valid digital elevation model. Now, not all of the data available through ZMI was actually flown with the purpose of hydrologic modeling. So about 40% of the area for this particular subset over Zanzibar city was actually usable for that. So we actually had to merge it with some other hydrologically valid elevation models, specifically Merit Hydro in this case. We got some really, really fantastic results where you can see fine details of coastal features with smooth transitions between the data that actually are aiding in doing flood modeling in the downstream processes that are happening now, funded by Tanzanian Urban Resilience Program. So really exciting stuff, really powerful possibilities in the area of commons-based peer production. In this case, camera being the tool, people being the glue, and a passion for creating products that help us support those challenges that we have globally and in your backyard. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Excellent. All right. So now we are, for our last but definitely not least presentation, we have Dr. Mahar Lagmay. Dr. Lagmay is the Executive Director of the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, or UPRI. UPRI was established as a proactive hub of benchmark innovative information vital to the nation's efforts in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Its mission is to empower local communities through multidisciplinary actions towards resilience. Dr. Lagmay was the founding executive director of the Philippine Department of Science and Technology's Nationwide Operational Assessment of Hazards, or NOAA, now operating within UPRI. Dr. Lagmay has published over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, mostly in international ISI journals, and was the first Asian to receive the Plinius Medal in 2015 from the European Geosciences Union for outstanding achievements in interdisciplinary natural hazard research and natural disaster engagement in the Philippines. So very excited to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Lagmay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carolyn. Let me share my screen. Okay, there you go. Just checking, can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, play from start. All right. Okay, I was asked by Selena to give a talk on the work that we do at UP Resilience Institute on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And I would like to congratulate the wonderful talks of the previous speakers, because I believe in what you said, what you just said. I believe that in doing climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction work, it is important for us to develop these tools that empower the people in communities. And we should share the data sets. We should develop technologies that empower the people in communities by getting them to share the data as well that they collected themselves. It's making use of technologies. Okay. Since the topic is about climate change, I'd like to first define the things that we do in terms of addressing this clear and present danger, the problem that we have on global warming. To address climate change, we have to deal with mitigation as well as deal with adaptation against climate change. And it's very important that we realize the distinction between the two. The first is that mitigation is avoiding and reducing emissions of heat-trapping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And adaptation means altering our behavior and systems. And these are actions that reduce the negative impacts of climate change while taking advantage of potential new opportunities. For mitigation, basically we're dealing with making use of renewable energy sources like wind, solar, biomass, hydro, and so on to address this problem on increasing CO2 that is injected into our atmosphere as well as other greenhouse gases that makes the global temperature to rise. So by mitigating these things that we do, we actually try to avert that increase in temperature that is dangerous to us in the future. Mitigation is actually a function of adaptation, and in considering mitigation strategies, there is a need to consider the cost of adaptation. So placement of investments should be resilient to climate change impacts. And when we talk about adaptation, we try to bring in all of these technologies. Some of those technologies that Ivan mentioned and the other speaker, if I didn't get the name, I'm sure would be very, very helpful in this effort. So we try to make the cities and municipalities of the country to become resilient, and they're called the smart and resilient cities. Basically, we're trying to address the impacts of climate change. I mean the adverse impacts, like for example, increased frequency of typhoons, the typhoons being projected to become more powerful with stronger winds, heavier rains that will bring bigger floods, trigger more landslides, also drought and more fires. And all of these things need to be addressed at community level. These are national policies, just give guidance and direction. In order for us to be able to do climate change adaptation well, for it to be successful, we must have an understanding of disasters. That means that these are the impacts of natural hazards as we have seen them. There's this phrase that was coined by Hagman in 1984, which I totally agree with, which we need to do. And it's stated as disasters are manifestations of unresolved problems of development, which only means that communities need to be planned well. And for us to be able to plan it well, we must understand natural phenomena as well as climate change projections. These are actually the same natural hazards, but are aggravated because of global warming. Now, we always try to get these scientific knowledge and technologies be understood by people in the community. That is of fundamental importance. And it's not only science and technology that can get them to understand with better computer graphics or whatever, even art or sculptures or music can get the people in communities understand the problem that will affect them, uh, or that has affected them, and including those impacts that will affect them in the future. So basically, I'm talking about the projected climate change impacts by majority of the scientists all over the world. So I'm just giving to you an example of a graphic, an infographic made by a famous Brazilian artist showing what we do with our environment. You have that river. If you look at the first three images on the top, you have that river. It's doing its thing. No? It's following the natural course of the river. But when it rains, it floods the floodplains. The water floods the floodplains. And when it's not raining, it goes back to its natural form, more or less. But what man has been doing, or what we have been doing, is that we try to claim the floodplains, buy those properties, and claim it as ours. But actually, it's really part of the river. So look at the images at the bottom. There are three images there. You see a bulldozer trying to straighten up that curved river, putting in dikes to make the future settlements become safe, or at least they think that it will be safe. So the houses are built and the river is there when it's not raining, but come the time when it rains, all of the people who live in those houses would be wondering why it flooded when engineering measures were already undertaken. But what these images really say or mean is that nature will take its course. And these floodplains are really part of the river system. It's theirs, it's not ours. So this kind of art can be translated into some kind of another graphic, another way to view it, an infographic, or it's not an infographic, it's actually a real simulation of a flood with settlements that are shown in gray, and they're actually they were actually done through OpenStreet mapping. You can see the vectors of the buildings, and those buildings are actually well presented in that map, in that flood map. And when it rains, it's actually not like that now. It's the sun is shining. It's not like that now, but when it rains, that would be the scenario. And we need to get the people to understand that. Because if they don't understand that, they will always be complaining. And if there's a disaster and many people die, maybe they don't have an opportunity to complain anymore. We've done this on a national level. Starting from 2012, we were doing the flood maps for the entire country. Well, supposedly, but we were only able to reach about 60 to 70% of the country. The mapping of those buildings and houses is not yet complete, but because of the community effort, because of OpenStreet mapping, we are slowly getting to complete all of these structures that are needed for the people to be able to visualize this kind of flooding scenario. And we're doing it also for the other types of hazards like landslides and storm surges. This is a way by which policymakers, local government units can realize what the problem is, and also realize what the problem will be in the future if we are able to simulate the climate change projections and make them into maps like this. So this is a map that you're seeing. It's a digital map. It's online. It's at NOAA. You can find it at noaa.ph. And all of the simulations that we made are available free to download. It's high resolution, as you can see. It's down to village level, barangay level, so that the people in communities can see the problem very well. You can see here, this is the place where I live. It's called the University of the Philippines campus. You can see that the people who built this, who planned this campus, did it well. They reserved those places, those floodplains, as parks, This part and this part, and the buildings are away from those flood-prone areas. So basically, that's what we're doing. We do not only do it for the historical worst case scenarios, because according to the scientists, everything will become worse. So we cannot just rely on anecdotal accounts. We have to use computers, we have to use technologies to create simulations like this, the historical worst case, as well as climate change scenarios. So we cannot just rely on the worst case historical record. We have to upgrade that and present to the community for their planning what their vision of the community they want to be, put these hazards into the planning process. And to create these simulations or scenarios, you need technology. You have to have digital elevation models. And maybe this is the topic that Ivan and the other guy was talking about, and also Selena. So just to map all of these requires a lot of effort. And if we do it for each and every community of the country, and maybe it can be replicated elsewhere in the world, we're doing it for, or we're trying to do it for nearly 1,700 cities and municipalities of the country, putting in the scenarios as projected by the climate scientists, so that they can use these scenarios of climate change in the planning process. This is just one example. This is an example of a historical worst case, largely anecdotal account, flood and landslide hazard map. It agrees with what the people say because they have not yet experienced flooding there. So when asked where the evacuation center will be, or is the best place to be, everybody said, we have not experienced flooding in that place. But if we have climate change scenarios, it will reflect what the people are saying, and also the scenarios that are bigger than what they remember or what they have experienced. And if it's bigger, you wouldn't really like to put an evacuation center there, because if you do, and when the time comes that all of these impacts of climate change happen, then you are actually putting them at risk, more exposed and more vulnerable if it's an evacuation center. And then there will be a disaster. So people will die in those areas if we do not present all of these climate change scenarios. But it does not have to be about just evacuation centers. In the planning process, the planning should cut across all sectors through agriculture, coastal, water, health, forestry, biodiversity, environment, energy, education, tourism, and so on, even mining. We saw that the hazard, the biohazard, the SARS-CoV-2 affected everything, all sectors of society. It affected education, it affected tourism, and everything. So that means that we have in the planning process, incorporate all of these natural hazards, including the adverse impacts of climate change, which is actually just worsened cases of what we have experienced in terms of impacts of floods, landslides, and storm surges, or whatever they may be. And we have to address that, and that is called adaptation. So adaptation is very important. And if we are to follow the Sendai framework, it's not just about science. It's not just about engineering, wherein there's multidisciplinary collaboration. We have to work with the other fields like the psychologists, anthropologists, social scientists, the people in the humanities, musicians, artists, to be able to communicate with all other people in the community. And that is called interdisciplinary work. But to do all of these mainstreaming and education and getting the community to plan their community well, we must mainstream that scientific and technological things that we do, and work with LGUs and NGOs, the crowd, stakeholders, and that's called as transdisciplinary work. And for that to work, there must be trust. I heard somebody talking about trust in communication, and to be able to establish that trust in science, which is fundamental, by the way, because science needs to be replicable. And in trying to communicate, and if we are to follow that Sendai framework, wherein we have to do a science-based approach and a whole society approach, we must be able to have open source, the science openly available. There must be open knowledge. There must be open government and open data. That builds trust, and that trust is a requirement for communicating the information that we need to communicate to the people in the community. And that will actually bring forth better adaptation against climate change and also current disaster risk reduction efforts. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Lagmay. So I know that we're a little bit over time. So what I propose to do, we have one question in the chat that I'm seeing that came during Dr. Lagmay, during your presentation. So I'm going to present that question, and then maybe, since we are at the end of time, just have one question for the group for everyone to address, and then we can wrap up. So apologies for not being a little bit more of a taskmaster in managing the time here. But Dr. Lagmay, so the question that we have coming in is, how do you get the elevation data to make these flood simulations and maps? Are you already using sourcing methods presented by Ivan and Stephen in their presentations?
No, I have not yet used the platform of Ivan and Stephen. But way back in 2012, we had a program called NOAA. It was the program of the president of the government during that time, wherein there was heavy funding to build sensors, deploy it all over the Philippines. There were about 2,000 sensors, locally manufactured, by the way, and locally deployed. No aid from consultants from foreign countries, because we believe in disaster mitigation. It's important to use local resources. So that was what our direction was. So we tried to get our own LiDAR instrument to map out the entire country, but we were not successful in mapping out the entire country. 2/3 of the country was mapped out at high resolution, but we also got this kind of service from another country, which was to map out the entire country using radar, which was airborne. It's called IPSAR. So we have a nationwide data set of digital elevation models for DTM, bare Earth, by the way, for the country, and also higher resolution data sets from LiDAR. What I can see now is that with the drone mapping, because each and every disaster, the landscape changes. So you have that base topography, which is necessary to get the entire watershed and to be able to update it for the community. We can make use of these drone maps, these drone maps that create digital elevation models that include bare Earth models. So we need to update them. Right now, because of some kind of problems, the IFSAR and the LiDAR has not yet, as I know it, has not yet been continued the way we wanted it to be on a nationwide scale. So policies change. We don't want to be bound by those changes in policy. We want something that empowers the community. They have a handle on what they can do at their fingertips. And these are the technologies that Ivan and Steven were talking about. So we need to upgrade all of these DTMs with lower cost technologies, make the community do it themselves, because if they do it themselves, it raises their stake in solving the problem on disasters and climate change.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Dr. Lagma, just a quick request if you could stop sharing your screen. There's another question that just came in. And so hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to answer this. And I don't know if Ivan or Selena, if you want to take this one. The question is, who or how is common source data verified, and what impacts do such maps have on land values?
Ivan, do you want to do a two-parter? I'll address the data validation side. So first and foremost, for all the projects that we do, we're in a constant state of local validation. So at every point of a project, we always refer back and check at that the data is accurate moving forward. But I know Ivan specializes in land rights and land use. So if you want to take that side of the question.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the short answer is that having a decent survey of your land increases its value. The long answer, which I don't have to have time to fully give, but I can hint at a little bit, is that throughout the world, land title is a pretty big scam. There's an enormous amount of corruption. Well, I'm from Canada, and the process by which what we call crown land, public land, gets converted into private land, if you'd really dig into it, it's grotesque. And that only gets worse in a lot of contexts where there's less sort of democratic accountability. Even in democratic countries, it's terrible. And so one of the implications of communities having the ability to do their own surveying and to understand really clearly that, what their own land occupation and use is considerably more sort of transparency around land allocation. So quick example, in the country of Haiti, the total surface area of land titles is 3 times the surface area of the country, because successive governments award land to their cronies. Land title is one of the things that you can give to your supporters without receipts. You don't have to justify to donors who you've given land to. So this may not be what every sort of developing government wants to hear, but in fact, community power to understand geography, and especially sort of, land boundaries and title at a really granular level, has tremendous implications for small landholders. So yeah, the short answer, sure, if there's a survey, the land is worth more. Long answer, it suddenly opens an entire can of worms about who actually owns and controls it and how the land title system works and the accountability therein. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So I think the next session is starting in a few minutes. So my final question, just in thinking about, the audience that we have for this particular conference and, the goals of the Understanding Risk conference overall, I'd like to just ask all of you to respond with nice pithy answers, if possible. But, I think that as our audience or in thinking about the incentives for using free and open source software, or how we can incentivize or to ensure that free and open source software is funded and institutionalized by the donors that we're working with, so they really are embedded in the way that programs are doing business. I'd love to kind of hear from each of you. What do you think are the main 1 or 2 barriers to making that happen? And again, this is a very large large question, but what are those barriers and how have you seen that? What can we do to unlock? And then we hopefully will have a chance, based on your responses and presentations, hopefully our audience will dig in and connect with each of you individually. But maybe I'll start with Ivan, since you're right on my screen. You want to go for it?
The biggest barrier is entrenched moneyed interests who don't want it because the proprietary software and these barriers to entry safeguard the interests of the people who already have the power and money. So it's that simple. And what's the answer? The answer is demanding justice. It's activism. It's the same way that we advocate for Black Lives Matter. It's the same way that we advocate for women's rights. It's the same way that we advocate for LGBTQ rights and trans rights and all of the people who aren't getting the same fair shake. So yeah, the answer here is to advocate for justice. That may sound facile. It's hard, but that's the answer.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Lagma, I'll go to you next.
Just a minute. Okay. But my talk was about really on the advocacies of the UP Resilience Institute and Project NOAA. And there are two main points that we have learned that we need to do. And this is called probabilistic assessments, those multi-scenario maps that I was talking about, multi-scenario maps of the future that includes climate change, is all about probabilistic risk assessment. The other advocacy that we have is about open data. With these two advocacies, we have really been having a hard time. And I don't see I don't see why, because it's fairly logical, and there's a basis for it. People have been talking about it, and we have signed. We have documents, like, for example, agreements in the Sendai framework, which talk about openness, which talk about approaches that are science-based and a whole of society. And when we talk of whole of society approaches and science-based approaches, these two advocacies that I just talked about fit exactly to what the Sendai framework guiding principles are saying or is saying. Now, it's quite difficult to have it mainstream in our country. And the reason is somewhat related to what Ivan said, I think. So there's this control, and control is power. And we have to answer that, and we have to change that. We have to show them through other kinds of technologies, those that are available, those that were presented, to be able to challenge what is the existing state, or what is the status quo. And when there are technologies that are disruptive, these disruptive technologies are actually stopped or challenged by those who would like to maintain the status quo. So I guess I'll end there. What you just said is actually exactly the same things that we are experiencing here in the country, and it's quite unfortunate. It's sad because we're dealing with people's lives.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Selena, I'll let you have the last word to wrap, since we're getting dinged a little, but we'll ask you for your response.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we already have the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And so it's really the donors who are approving loans to use this exact framework to be able to validate whether loans and programs should be justified. And what we've shown from our model, as well as the other free and open source technologies, is that there's really no good reason not to be using free and open source tools and geospatial tools, especially now where economies are devastated and we can't afford all the usual tech, and our communities cannot afford the usual tech. And so I implore the funders at their level, and I've experienced this in my projects as well, where there's a very narrow view on our projects where there's only 2 government agencies, for example, that are invited. Whereas I insist that we bring in all 11 government agencies. So it really has to rely on the donor level. And particularly with communities now that have lost so much funding, that it's the multinational organizations that will have an even bigger sway, who don't necessarily have the community's best interests at heart. And so I usually say that 2020 is hopefully a year of clarity and vision versus hindsight, because we've been through and used the same rhetoric before of Build Back Better. And so something has to change. And we're hoping that Open Knowledge Kit really becomes a part of that change.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Just want to take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers. Really appreciate it. All of our panelists for joining us today. And thank you to the Understanding Risk Asia conference and organizers. So look forward to seeing, I think, in other sessions. And please do follow up with our panelists if you have any questions. Thanks so much. Take care.